Okay, thank you. Good morning, everyone. Like the last lecture, this lecture is very thematic and also quite simple, but hopefully it will create some topics for discussion. Now, there's a little bit of overlap with what Father Ronheimer did, so I'm going to skip some part. I'm going to go quickly over some parts because I know that Christoph is going to talk about some of the same things, so I don't want to be overly repetitive. So, how can we think about economics? This is the kind of theme of this lecture. And we talked last night in our discussions about how sometimes there's a lot of misunderstandings about economics. Economics becomes sentimental, right? We see people out of work, and we say, okay, we've got to solve this. You know, we see companies making decisions. We see industries shutting down, and we think this is terrible. We have to do something about it. And there's a lot of, everybody has an opinion about economics, right? Not all of us are economists, but all of us have opinions about economics because economics is something that we experience in our lives, right there, and quite concrete. One of the things that I think is very interesting is the first time people from the United States or Europe go to the developing world, right, to Africa or Latin America, they come back interested in economics because to them that's their first cognitive experience of economics. The reality of so many things that they've taken for granted now stands stark in front of them. Now, of course, we know that that's not their first experience of economics. They've been experiencing economics their whole lives, but they haven't been cognitively aware of it. And so one of the things about economics is sometimes it is paradoxical. Sometimes the thing that we think will do will actually make things worse. And so what we're going to talk today is a little bit about some of these kind of ideas in economics, some of the key principles, and then some of the fallacies. But let's begin by saying, how does it relate to Christian thinking? How does it relate to Christian anthropology, to moral theology? Well, the common way we kind of think about economics is we have, moral philosophy and study of virtue over here, and then Christian anthropology here, and politics and economics and theology and physics and science and all these other things. And they're all separate. But I actually think that's kind of a problem because, and if you look back at, say, the development, is it too dark? There's not enough light on it, maybe? Okay. If you look back at the development of economics, Adam Smith was a professor of moral philosophy, right? And I think that a better way to understand, you can't see it, I don't know anyway, but the better way to understand it is here you have Christian anthropology. Who is the human person? What does it mean to be a person? What is a person? A person is a free being, rational. Yeah. Okay, that says Christian anthropology. Just pretend like you know what it says. I don't know why it's not clear, but anyway. So a human being is free, is rational. Do you know what Lord Acton really said, right? You know what he said? This is why I rarely use PowerPoint, because the reported thing is, power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolute. That's not what he said. He said power tends to corrupt, and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. Okay, this is why PowerPoint is bad. Don't worry about it. Okay. The big thing is. Yeah. Well, anyway. So the contrast between the Weiswert is amazing. All right. So here you have. So the question. I think a better way to think about economics is this. Here you have the human person, Christian anthropology. What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean to be an embodied person? What does it mean to have reason, to have will? Right? What does it mean to seek after the good? All of these questions, right? This is the first question that we have to ask. What does it mean to be a human person? Second, then, moral philosophy is the study of human action, of right and wrong, etc. And economics is the study of human action in the marketplace. So there's no radical separation. I mean, they may be different disciplines, but they're not radically distinct, as if human action has nothing to do with morality. human action in a marketplace has nothing to do with morality. Of course it does. There's relationships and between who the human person is. So I think there's a connection. So some of these things Father Ronheimer talked about already, but what does Christianity have to do with economics and wealth creation? Well, I think there's some important things. In the market, which are networks of human relationships, you have lots of decisions going on. People are making decisions to buy, to sell. People are making decisions to invest, to get different jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And this has to do with our nature as rational beings with freedom, with an intellect and a will. Economics also, I think, is deeply related to the idea of the human person made in the image of God with creative capacity. One of the reasons why human beings are able to create prosperity for their families and communities is because we are created in the image of a creative God. We are created co-creators. The other thing that Christianity brings to the economic sphere, which I think is very important, is a recognition of the dignity of work and a view of the material world. The material world is not evil, right? The material world is not bad. We're not in some kind of Platonic or different Manichaean understanding where we're trying to separate and break away from the material world, which is evil, but rather the material world is good because God created it good, right? We talked about how the world is fallen and the human being is fallen. But one of the things that if you look at most societies, say the Greeks or different people, the Romans, you have this idea of servile work is bad, right? That labor is not really dignified. But the Jewish and the Christian tradition actually say, no, labor is dignified, right? Now there's still the difference between the servile arts and liberal arts, but the idea that work has value, right? So remember, and Father Ronheimer pointed this out, work comes before the fall, right? Work is not a punishment from the fall. It is the toil of work that comes after the fall. So work is good, work is dignified. And this has a very important effect on economy. Because if you think, well, work and commercial life is really, for the lower classes. And the aristocrats and the nobles, well, we don't actually do work because, well, it's beneath us. Or if this happens, right? It happens in Europe, doesn't it? And so, and then they all became poor until they began to become crony capitalists. Right? It always happens that way. Anyway, but if you have a different understanding that no, work in fact is a dignified activity, and there's no shame in being a laborer or a merchant or someone in commerce. This has an impact on the way we understand economics and society. And so we also talked about a whole host of other things. Yesterday we mentioned, for example, that in the Birth of Freedom movie that we saw, that economic development, the idea of the market economy, of economic liberty, of the creation of value, actually comes out of the Jewish Christian tradition, and also in that providential relationship between Hellenism and Jewish and Christian ideas. So there's no radical distinction, I would say, between economics and Christianity. Sometimes people say, well, economics is a very modern discipline. It's rooted in the Enlightenment. All of the assumptions of economics are reductionist Enlightenment visions, and that's just not true. It's just not historically true or economically true, for that matter. So let me give some other examples. They're important. When we talk about a free economy, now maybe let me pause for a second. Sometimes what you hear, especially in religious circles, is you have this idea in religious circles that economics is almost outside the realm of religion. So that we heard an example of somebody saying, well, yeah, but you engage in mutual benefit of trade, or you do something for profit. And the religious person, the theologian, says, but you shouldn't do that, right? And so there's this kind of sense that somehow modern economics are utilitarian, the free market is based on exploitation, etc. But in fact, if you look at the history, what you find is that the foundations of a market economy, private property, limited government, justice in the courts and rule of law, free exchange, market determination of price, and freedom of association all develop and come out of the Christian tradition, especially in the medieval tradition. So all these ideas get developed in the medieval tradition. And so Adam Smith, for example, Joseph Schumpeter, the great economic historian, said that Smith said almost nothing original. Most of the ideas that Smith had had been developed by medieval theologians over hundreds of years. So it's important to recognize that the study of economics is not somehow outside of our tradition, but part of our tradition. And I think it needs to be recovered, especially in the study of what the medieval economists were thinking. So is this not, you can't see it? I don't know why. Okay, this was my best slide. I mean, it was genius. So, I mean, you would have left this conference and thought, oh, I've never seen a better slide in my life. But Christoph messed it up. So, you know. Anyway, it's, yeah, it's, right. Anyway, it's not that important. It's really not that great of a slide. I mean, it would have changed your life. But no, it's just something happened in the transfer. It's all right. Don't worry about it. PowerPoint corrupts. No, it's all right.
No, here it comes.
Oh, there it is. Oh, there you go. Okay. Ah, there we go. Yeah. Okay. So, whoever put this thing on there is not smart. All right.
That was him. He gave me this hint.
Yeah.
He knew.
He knew. Okay, good. You're genius. Okay. Whoever had this idea was not good. Okay, so for example, if you look at medieval economic analysis, you have ideas like division of labor is discussed, a theory of money from Aristotle through the scholastics. Right? There are different, there's already debates about the theory of money. The idea of market price. The market price is, so basically the Thomistic idea of a market price. Right? Market price doesn't just come out of Adam Smith or out of neoclassical economics. The medieval idea of a market price is that market price is determined by three things. By utility, okay, difficulty of production, and common estimation. This is how a just price is determined. By utility, right, how useful the thing is to the person. By difficulty of production, right, so how hard was it to produce, right? Some things are harder to produce than other things. And that tends to what? Raise the price. And the third thing is what? Common estimation. Well, what is common estimation? Common estimation is a market. Okay, so you have this idea that somehow, oh well, this is such utilitarian thinking, but no, it's actually part of the tradition because it has to do with prudence. The idea of self-interest, that you make decisions that are beneficial to yourself, that is distinct from greed, right? All these questions are discussed. Same with the question of subjective value. Let me give you a quick thing on subjective value. We'll probably talk about it in a little bit later. Well, I think it was Augustine who first uses the diamond and water paradox. All right? So let's talk about subjective value. What does it mean that there's subjective value? It means, and this is very much of an Austrian concept, right? That different people attach different values to different things. It's not relativism. It's that the different person attaches different value to different things. So for example, one of the great examples of subjective value and supply and demand is what's called the diamond and water paradox. All right? Water here in Austria, as we see, is very plentiful. There's lots of water. Diamonds, on the other hand, not so many. So let's say you want to go out and you want to get engaged. All right? And so you decide you're going to go out and you're going to buy a diamond ring. Okay? Now, diamonds are useless. Unless you want to cut something, right? But still, they're deeply prized because of their beauty, because of their significance, because of their meaning, all these things. So people will spend a lot of money on diamonds. So if somebody says, okay, diamonds, it's going to cost you, 4,000 euros for the diamond ring. Okay, 4,000 euros. And water, €1.50. Right? So and people will pay lots of money for diamonds. And there's another thing I'll talk about later. Why? Because there's a lot of water, and there's not that many diamonds. Everybody wants water, everybody needs water, but there's a lot of water, so water's cheap. Not a lot of diamonds, and everybody wants diamonds. Since everybody wants diamonds, and there's not a lot of them, the price goes up. Now, what happens if you go into the desert? And you're riding along on your camel, and your camel breaks down. Okay? Camels don't usually break down. It's cars that break down. But anyway. All right, so you're riding and your camel breaks down. And now you're walking through the desert. And you've got a sack of diamonds that you're about to, go through the desert to Vienna to sell at the market. And you've got your sack of diamonds, and you're out of water, and you're about to die. And somebody comes by with a big thing of water. And you say, can I buy some water for you? And he says, yeah, 3 diamonds. Will you be willing to pay for the water with the diamonds? Of course you will. 1 diamond, 2 diamonds. You'd pay 5 diamonds, right? Because if you don't pay for your 3 diamonds, you'll lose all your diamonds anyway because you'll be dead, right? So would you do the same thing here, say, walking out the street here as you're walking down to the Spar, people said, hey, I'll trade you some diamonds for water? Of course not, right? So what happens is there is, in fact, subjective value that even Augustine talked about. All right. The other thing, and I'm going to go into some of these in detail later. The other thing is, if you look into the medieval economic tradition, it again is not, economics does not begin with Adam Smith. It does not begin with the Enlightenment. But you see medieval economist John Burdon in early 1300s dealing with value measured by human wants and community. All right? How is value measured? By the human want and by the community. This has to do with a market price. Common estimation is a market price. All right? Second, you see Lorenzo di Antonio di Ridolfi, the first detailed discussion of foreign exchange. So foreign exchange is not a new phenomenon. And this is actually an important thing. Father Ronheimer mentioned there are some weaknesses in Rodney Stark's book, but I highly recommend Stark's book called The Victory of Reason, because one of the things it talks about is that the origins of banking did not begin, right, in the Enlightenment. They actually began sometimes in the 8th to 9th century, probably the 9th century in Italy. Also 11th, 12th, 13th century, you have a lot of development of banking in the city-states in Italy, in the Netherlands, and other places. So it's important to realize that banking is not a modern, like kind of foreign exchange is not just an Enlightenment phenomenon either. And why is this important? Why do I keep talking about all these things before I go into the kind of meat? Is because it's important for us to get into our minds that, as I've said before, economics is not simply a modern secular discipline of the Enlightenment. No, it's in fact deeply shaped by Christian theological reflections on the economy. In fact, do you know where most of the reflections of the economy are found? Most of the reflections of the economy are found in confession manuals. Because as banking and commerce began to emerge, people would go to their priest and they say, what do I do? How do I deal with this situation? And priests would begin to think and talk to one another. And they developed actually in the confessional manuals in Latin how to handle some of these complex economic situations. How do you do these things? So what happens is, what happens is we have this idea that's both the secular idea and the Christian idea that somehow, economics is not part of our tradition. Again, St. Bernardino of Siena, 1380 to 1444. The sources of value are utility, scarcity. And again, just price is a common estimation, which we'll talk about in more detail. San Antonio, the Archbishop of Florence, and Thomas de Vio, the Cardinal Cajetan, also wrote 3 treatises on economics and banking. One of the most famous parts is the Salamanca school that was mentioned last night as well. Francisco de Vitoria, and you see here Juan de Medina, Luis de Molina. All of these people are writing translations. Now, the Acton Institute, in fact, is translating some of these things into English and putting them in our Journal of Markets and Morality. So you can read some of these pieces here. And again, I recommend highly the book by Alejandro Schafwen called Faith and Liberty, The Economic Thought of the Late Scholastics, which is, again, available at Acton. Okay, so let's now move to some of the key elements. Let's try to think a little bit like economists. Let's begin. What is economics, right? Economics, I already said, is the study of human action in the marketplace. But what else is it? Henry Hazlitt has a wonderful definition in his book called Economics in One Lesson. How many people know this book? Economics in One Lesson. Okay, this is a great book. You should read the book. It's very fun, very easy, etc. All right. And he says, the art of economics, okay, this is important. Let's think about it. The art of economics consists in looking not merely at the immediate, but at the long effects of any act or policy. So not just the immediate, not just what happens now, but at the long-term effects of any act or policy. It consists in tracing the consequences of the policy not only for one group, but for all groups. So for example, in, I think it was early 2000 in the United States, President George Bush there was lobbying and all these encouragement, and he decided that he would make a decision to protect the steel industry in the United States. Okay, he'd protect the steel industry in the United States. So what happened is, they said, okay, what we're going to do is all these, see, China was selling steel in the United States cheaper than the Americans could produce steel. So we said, well, we want to keep the American steel industry going. So what we'll do is we'll put a tariff up so that Chinese steel, instead of, say, being $100 per unit, is now $110 per unit. So the tariff goes up. And now U.S. steel, which was selling at $105, and so could not compete with the Chinese, now Chinese steel is more expensive. So the U.S. can now sell steel and keep the steel industry going. Is that clear? You got it? All right. So this is what happened. They built up the tariffs. Now, the art of economics consists in not merely looking at the immediate, but at the long effects. So what happened in the long term with these steel subsidies? Well, first thing that happened is, good thing. Steel began to grow, right? Because all it's naturally going to happen. This is the thinking, right? Okay, if we protect steel, then American steel producers are going to get more contracts, and the steel industry is going to grow, and all the steel workers are going to have better jobs, and more money, and better economy, and the communities are going to flourish, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay? So, what happens in the long run? Well, the long run connects to the next part of not one group, but all groups. Now, there are not only steel producers in the United States, there are steel users in the United States. There are steel consumers, car companies, construction, etc. Now, they were buying all their steel at $100 per unit. Now, they have to pay $105 per unit. So they're starting to pay more money. So their costs are going up. So the car producers are now spending more money per car and machines and all the other things than they did previously. All right? So their cost starts to increase. Now, what happens? They say, well, you know, their competitors, say in other countries, are buying Chinese steel at $100 per unit. So now, all of a sudden, their prices are higher than their competitors' prices. And so they're starting to lose business. And they think, maybe we need to lay off staff. What are we going to do? So the steel workers are working, and they're working, but now all the steel users are thinking, oh my goodness, we're starting to lose our business. So what happened is, logically, some of the steel companies shut down in the United States. And they moved their companies to Mexico or to other countries. Why? Because there they could buy Chinese steel at a lower price. And so they shut down their companies and they moved. So what happened? Economics in one lesson. Because they only looked at the immediate effects for one group, it protected the steelworkers in the short run. But in the long run, it actually affected other groups negatively. They had to close down their shops. And of course, the steelworkers begin to lose because now there are fewer customers and steelworkers have to get laid off. So the point of this exercise is to say that when we make an economic policy decision, it can actually have unintended consequences. And one of the ways you avoid the unintended consequences, you can't avoid it completely, okay? Why? We live in a fallen world. We have limited knowledge. You can't make perfect decisions. A lot of times you're making risk, you don't know, you're making, et cetera. But one of the ways you can avoid it is by taking economics seriously. And this, I think, is one of the important lessons, especially if we think like Christians. It's important that we don't somehow say, well, I think like a Christian about theology and moral philosophy and the sacraments and marriage and all these other things. But, you know, there's no, I don't have to take economics seriously because it's not a Christian discipline. Well, sure. It's not a Christian discipline, but it is a human discipline. And the virtue that I think is related to economics, like the virtue related to so many things, is the mother of all the virtues, which is prudence, which I like. Joseph Pieper has this more or less definition that he says, prudence is seeing the world as it is and acting accordingly. Prudence is seeing the world as it is and acting accordingly. Now remember, there are 4 cardinal virtues, right? Justice, temperance, courage, and prudence. Okay? And they're called the cardinal virtues because they are the hinges on which the moral life leads. Now, why is prudence so important? Because if you don't see the world as it is and act accordingly, you actually can't be just. How can you be just if you don't see the world as it is? If you're not prudent, it actually affects your ability to be just. And so there's a wonderful line I saw from Aquinas recently. It says that injustice can occur in 2 ways. One, by the violent act of the man who abuses his power. Right? This is one. And second, by the false prudence of the sage. So actually, injustice can occur if the sage, the wise man, the policy planner, ends up being imprudent and making decisions that actually hurts people. I think this is I'll talk about this later today when I talk about poverty. I think this is the classic problem of the way we deal with poor people, is that we have injustice occurs because of the false prudence of the sage. All the wise economic planners in Washington and Brussels and New York and Paris and London are making these decisions on behalf of all the poor people throughout the world, but a lot of times those decisions are imprudent, and it ends up creating injustice. So economics, I think, is related to prudence, okay? Now, oftentimes we think about economics like this, right? Okay, we're going to talk about economics. Here it is. Are you ready? Okay, and there's probably maybe 2 of you in the room who are like, oh, this is exciting. I can't wait to do, some equations, all right? We oftentimes think of economics like this. And there's a little bit of truth. Some of economics is like that. But unfortunately, a lot of this is what economics has been reduced to. Economics is not primarily about numbers. Economics is primarily about the study of human action in a marketplace, about human interactions. Okay? So let's talk about a little bit about some basic economic thinking. All right? Number 1, first of all, I think it's important to remind ourselves and remind the economists in the room that economics does not exhaust reality. You cannot explain all of reality, all decision-making through economics. It explains part of reality. It's a very helpful tool in understanding how people interact. It's a potent force because, as we talked about last night, one of the reasons people go into business is to actually feed themselves and their families, right? I mean, economics is related to this kind of core, visceral elements of human life. I'm hungry, and I need to eat. I'm cold, and I need shelter. So economics is an important part of life, but it doesn't explain all of life. All right? So it's necessary but not sufficient. Okay, so let's talk about some of the core elements of economics. All right? And we've already touched on a little bit of it. The basic economic problem is what? It's called scarcity. Scarcity and trade-offs. Why scarcity? Because there's always limited resources. Scarcity means there's limited resources. And what goes along with limited resources, ladies and gentlemen, but unlimited wants. So the basic problem of economics is that everybody wants tons of things, and there's not enough to go around. Is that clear? You're following me? So there's scarcity. There's not enough stuff, but everybody wants stuff. For example, how many people want a beach house in the south of France? Right? Most people want a beach house in the south. How about a mountain house up in the Alps? Yeah. Okay. How about a nice villa in Italy? Okay. How about maybe a private jet so you can fly to your house in California? Well, you have all those things. Yeah. A simple banker. How about a Porsche? Father Ronheimer, would you like a Porsche? Okay, yeah. Ferrari, yeah. Okay. So everybody wants Yeah, everybody wants lots of things, but there are not enough beach houses or mountain villas or Italian villas to go around for everyone. This is the first problem of scarcity. So you have to figure out how you make decisions. When we talk of scarcity with an economic context, it's not a lack of riches, it's a lack of resources, right? Land, labor, capital, etc. So people must make choices between different items because the resources to fulfill their needs are limited, all right? And one of the ways we do this is by making trade-offs, okay? So scarcity is a reality. Scarcity is a reality. There's always more wants than there are stuff. But it's also important to keep in mind that while scarcity is a reality, it is a snapshot of time. So, and we'll talk about this in a couple minutes when I talk about some of the fallacies. But right now I'll say one of the big fallacies of economics is that the economy is a pie. And that's as much as there is. And the pie, and if the rich have more, the poor have less. And in order to get the poor to be equal, you have to take away from the rich to give to the poor, right? The problem with this kind of thinking, and this applies to lots of different things, the problem with this kind of thinking is that it takes the reality of scarcity and it makes it the snapshot into a persistent reality. But in fact, economies can grow. And so we have to be able to pay attention to this as well. So let's talk about trade-offs for a minute. Trade-offs are closely related. So the first thing we need to pay attention to is scarcity. Second, trade-offs. Trade-offs are closely related to scarcity because you can't have everything you want, right? You make trade-offs. For example, if I want a Porsche, I can't have a house, okay? If I want to have, organic, bio, high-end, very nice beef and expensive bread and go to nice restaurants, I can't have a Porsche, right? Some people can have both. I mean, bankers are not people, so it's a little different. Oh, no, simple bankers, that's not true. All right, so, right, if I want to protect an industry through China, through tariffs so we can protect jobs from being sent to India or China, we can make a trade-off. Let me give you an example. In Switzerland, they subsidize their agriculture. In Japan, they do in the United States and all throughout the European Union. But let's say, for example, you want a trade-off. All right? Let me give you a couple examples. First of all, if you want lots of public space and parks, right? And you want to make sure that the city that you live in doesn't have too many high-rise buildings and everything like this, you can do it. You can make laws for that. The problem is the price of housing will go up. It's a trade-off. If you allow lots of building, the price of housing will go down, but you'll have some maybe ugly city. There are trade-offs. It's part of the reality of the human condition. So in Switzerland, for example, you say, okay, we want to subsidize our agriculture, subsidize our farmers, because two things maybe. We want to keep Switzerland the way it beautifully has always looked. We love the landscape. We like the culture of things. It's worth it for us. We want national security. After all, we live next to the Germans, and sometimes they get angry at us. Okay, we need to build some walls. Okay, etc. Right? Japanese do the same thing with rice. Right? They want to have rice because it's part of their culture, so they subsidize their rice. They could get rice much cheaper from Thailand or from other places, but instead they subsidize their rice, and they're an island. What if the Chinese come and get at us? We better protect ourselves so we can eat. So let's go back. So Switzerland, they decide we're going to protect our industry and our agriculture. All right? So there's a trade-off that goes on. Swiss people will now pay more money for meat, for cheese, and for butter, and for other things that they protect. And in return, they get the landscape they want, the feeling of the cultural continuation, and security. Now, notice, I'm actually not saying that's wrong. That's fine. If that's what the people agree to do, it's fine. What you'll notice, however, is politicians will never tell you the truth. Politicians will tell you, we can subsidize and keep Swiss culture and farms and all the things, and you still won't pay more. No, yes, you'll pay more. There's a trade-off. It might be a good trade-off. It might be worth it to be economically inefficient for some other good. It's fine. Economic efficiency is not the highest value. right? So you may make a decision to do it. But remember, some people are winning, some people are losing. There's trade-offs at these things. Or everybody's winning one thing and losing another thing. And it's important when we talk about economics that we don't forget scarcity and trade-offs, because when we do, then we think, let's go back to the Swiss example. How many of you think it's a good idea, say, for Switzerland to subsidize their agriculture, put high tariffs, protect their farming, so to keep their culture and national security? How many think that's a good idea? Okay, all right. How many people think it's a bad idea? Okay, and how many people don't care? Okay, so if you vote, what happens is you get the good ideas versus the bad ideas versus the I don't cares. The people with who are trying to pay. Everybody's trying to buy off the people who don't care. No, I'm teasing. So what happens? You make a vote and then you have a decision. The problem is that doesn't work in democratic politics, does it? In democratic politics, you have to pretend like, no, it will be both. It's not. It's not both. And this actually infects religious thinking. It's very interesting to me that I think the best kind of like hermeneutic for understanding economics is the fall, original sin. It's a wonderful way to understand how economics works. It teaches you that you can't have heaven on earth, that there are trade-offs, that human nature, greed, all these things. It's a wonderful thing. I mean, there's nothing better to understand economics than to take the fall seriously. And it gives you this wonderful framework to think about economics seriously. So many Christians, despite the fact they take the fall seriously, seem to however forget the fall when they come to economics, as if you could just kind of create some policies that make everything perfect. So trade-offs are a central concept of economics. All right? Again, if you protect an industry for national security reasons, right? So for example, airplanes in the United States. If you could produce airplanes cheaper outside the United States, right? Perhaps. All right? But would the United States want to produce their airplanes outside the United States? Of course not. It would be a bad idea. Why? Because if a war begins, then they don't have to build the factories. They already have airline production. So they can subsidize it so when they need to build military planes, they can build it. Okay? It could be a wise decision to be economically inefficient. It could be a wise decision. But the point is, it's a reality that we need to take into account. All right? And so again, theologians, it should make sense. You can't lead a wild, promiscuous lifestyle, cheat on your wife, forsake your children, and have a happy, stable family. Right? It doesn't work. Okay? All right. So the next thing that in economics is I already talked about that. Okay, yeah. The next thing is supply and demand. All right? Now, we often think about the supply and the demand curve, right? The more supply, the lower the price. The greater the demand, the smaller supply, the higher the price. So again, I've already given the example of the diamond and water, right? Diamonds are low in supply, high in demand. Water, even though it's essential for human life and abundant, there's a high demand, but there's a great supply, so the price is lower. Okay, so we've talked about this idea then of subjective value already. I've already done that. Okay. Now, I talked about subjective value and this idea that people attach values to different things. But it's important here that we make we go back to that for a minute and make a distinction. Subjective value, right, is one type of value. Subjective value doesn't mean that I'm saying that there's ethical relativism or value relativism. Okay? This, in fact, sometimes is a fault of economists who think, oh, because there's subjective value in price, there must be subjective value in everything. There's a study, I think it's Tom Woods who writes about this study. I think it is. But he shows that there's a comparison, an interesting comparison. Those people who are value relativists tend to believe price is objective. It's an interesting paradox. While those people who believe that values are not relative, that there's good and evil, right and wrong, tend to think that prices are subjective and relative. So it's an interesting paradox, something for you to think about. All right. So So when you have subjective value, right, we've already talked about how they have different values for different things, diamonds or waters, or some people, there's a game called the trading game, all right? And this refers to what talked about last night. Sometimes we're not going to play the trading game, are we? No, okay. All right, so there's a thing called the trading game. This is how the trading game works, all right? So let's say, for example, what we'll do is we give everybody, we go to the dollar store, and we buy a little cheap thing, you know, crayons, a hairbrush, I don't know, a toy, some pens, some makeup, etc. And we give everybody randomly a different good. Then you get that good, and you assign to it a subjective value from 0 to 10. So crayons. All right, I have 5 little children. Crayons, they like children. Okay, I'll give that a 7 because I can take this and the children will like it. Okay. Hairdryer. I don't need a hairdryer, all right, because I'm bald. So I say 0 has no subjective value. Or maybe my wife wants a hairdryer, so maybe I'll give it an 8 because my wife's hairdryer just broke. And so, you know, my subjective value is changing. So if everybody puts their subjective value and you assign a number, this is a game we play. It's a magnificent. We're not playing it this year. You assign a number to it. We collect all the numbers and we add the numbers up. Let's say we get 100. And then we say, okay, we'll divide the room in half. And this half of the room can trade with each other, and that half of the room can trade with each other. And everybody begins to trade. Right? And say, oh, yeah, my sister likes this thing. Or oh, I really love this. This is my favorite thing. Or, you know, I ran out of eyeshadow. I need eyeshadow. Right? Oh, perfect. As the man says, I don't use eyeshadow. You can have the eyeshadow. And it's a playing cards game. And he's a great gambler, and he wants to have playing cards. And you make all the trades. And then you finish, and you say, okay, everybody assign a value. Everybody assign a subjective preference value from 0 to 10. Everybody assigns the value, you collect it. Every single time, guess what? The general number goes higher. And then I say, okay, let's not just have regional trade, let's have global trade. And everyone in the room starts trading. The same thing happens, and what do you think happens to the subjective value? It goes up and up. Why? This is what was talked about last night in the Q&A. Exchanges are not equivalent. Right? What takes place is what's called the mutual benefit of trade. Right? People trade with one another because they see a benefit. If trade is free, and this is the important part, if trade is free, if it's not coerced, right? If I'm not forced to give Powell my iPhone, right, for his pen, right? If I'm not forced to make this trade, like I would not make the trade, would I? There's no purpose in making this trade for that, right? But let's say, you know, I'm in desperate need of a pen, okay? Because, you know, or let's say, let me trade it. Let's say Powell's had an iPhone and his iPhone's out of battery and I have a pen, okay? And he's just met the most beautiful woman he's ever seen in his entire life. And he says, oh, you know, I need to get this woman's phone number and address so I can call her and because I'm going to marry her. I mean, she's the most perfect person I've ever seen. And I'm walking along. And he's like, hey, do you have a pen? I was like, I do, but I kind of need it. I'll trade you my iPhone for the pen because it's out of battery and you just promise that you'll erase it. He would trade me the iPhone for the pen because the subjective value of this iPhone is nothing to the beautiful woman that he's going to marry. Okay? Right? You don't think so? Only a woman would say that. Yeah. Only a woman would say, I don't think so. The man would say, just give me the pen, right? Okay? Trust me. Yeah, you don't know anything, right? There's a reason God said it is not good for man to be alone, okay? Take the stupid iPhone, give me the pen, what's your number, nice to marry you. Okay, here we go. Nice to marry you, yeah? Right. Yes, yeah, but okay, but you're boring. And if she said no, then you'd be willing to do the pen. Okay, yeah, but if she said no, you'd get the pen. Okay, so you've got all these different things. Now, all these things are out there. All these there's subjective value, there's supply and demand, there's scarcity and trade-offs. And all of these things relate to the concept of price. Why do they relate to price? Prices are indicators of subjective values. And, okay, ready? Prices are indicators of subjective value and the relationship between supply and demand. Okay? Prices are also allocators and distributors. What do I mean? Everybody wants a beach house, but there's not enough beach houses to go around. So beach houses have a high demand, low supply, high subjective value. How do you decide who gets the beach house? You get it through prices. Now, some people are very upset at this. It's not fair. Some people can afford a beach house and other people can't. Okay? So let's look at the problem with fairness. Number one, let's say the government mandated, okay, everyone in Italy must have 25 weeks of vacation. How many do they have now? 24? Okay. 25 weeks of vacation and a beach house. The government says so. Okay? So you get your 25 weeks of vacation. It's important not to work too much. And then you get your beach house. There's a problem. There are not enough beach houses to go around. Now, in 500 years in Italy, when there are only 16 Italians left, you think that's a joke, but that's true. Philip Booth, he did a study. In the prediction, it might have slightly changed, but several years ago, the prediction was, if Italians continue at the same birth rate, in 500 years, there will be 16 Italians left. Okay? So there will be beach houses for all the Italians. But the general level of food culture will have dropped tremendously. Okay? All right. So there's not enough beach houses to go around because there's scarcity. So how do you allocate? Well, there's 3 ways you can allocate goods and services, right, basically. Tell me if you think of another one. Maybe I'm missing one. Number 1, you can allocate by price. Number 2, you can allocate by power, politics. And number 3, you can allocate by friendship. Okay? Price, power, or friendship. Can you think of anything else? How else would you allocate? Maybe I'm missing something. Feel free. I can't think of another. Anybody have another one? That's friendship. Okay. Now, let me give you an example. Okay? And I would argue of all those prices, the most not only efficient, but the most just. Here's why. Let's say, for example, there's an earthquake. Not an earthquake, hurricane. There's a hurricane, okay? So there's a hurricane, and you've got all the lights are out, and the people have been kicked out of their houses, and all these things like this. Okay, there's a big hurricane. All right. So the value, the subjective value of a flashlight has just gone from where? From here to here. Okay? Everybody now, all the electricity is out. The subjective value of flashlights have gone up. The subjective value of hotel rooms have gone up because people have been kicked out of their house. The demand for flashlights has gone up. The demand for hotel rooms has gone up. The supply of hotel rooms is the same. The supply of flashlights is the same too because the roads have been broken and the trucks can't get in with new flashlights yet. So the supply is the same as it was before the hurricane, yet the demand is radically higher and the subjective value is radically higher. So how do you determine who gets the hotel rooms or the flashlights? Let's say we do it on power. The government determines who gets the flashlights, or the government determines who gets the hotel rooms. Who do you think is going to get the hotel rooms? Those people who have what? The closest connection to the government, maybe voting power, maybe money, right? Maybe money, right? Because they can. What about, say, minority groups and the poor? Are they going to get it? Probably not. What about friendship? Okay, let's say the hotel, let's say I own the hotel, okay? And Paul comes to the hotel and says, Paul, good to see you. Yeah, we can have the hotel room, okay? And Christoph comes out, Christoph, great to see you, okay. What's your name again? I don't know you. Yeah, get out of here. Yeah, I don't know you. I don't know your name. I don't know you. You're not my friend. I don't know you. Leave. You, never seen you before. Oh, and a Spaniard. Oh, Argentina, I hate Argentine football. Oh, it's the worst, etc. No Argentines. Oh, get out of here, okay? All right? And so, but oh wait, did you have Argentine steaks? Or you have some steaks? Okay, you can come in because we like Argentine beef. Okay, so it begins, you start to make these decisions based on friendship, et cetera, or power. Now, let's ask some serious questions. Let's say that the person who owns the hotel is, has racism. He doesn't like certain kinds of people, like Argentines. Okay, all right. So he can actually end up making decisions based on his racial, ideas or on his friendship, all these other things like this. Okay, but now let's talk about price. What happens when the demand for because remember, if there's no price, if it's just power or friendship, you're not dealing with price. What happens when the price of flashlights goes up? I'm sorry, when there's a hurricane, the price of flashlights skyrockets. The price of hotel rooms skyrocket. And most people will say, this is a terrible thing. Now, let's make a caveat. It is very possible that a hotel owner could say, oh, I'm going to take advantage of these people. This is my time to make as much money as possible. And he could overcharge and do all these things, and actually he could do evil the way, in his intentions and everything. So it's possible. I'm not saying that, every price is perfect any more than friendship or political power is friend. You can abuse friendship, you can abuse power, you could even abuse the price mechanism, okay? But let's look what happens with price. When price goes up, let's take flashlights for example. Flashlights used to be $5. Now flashlights are $15. Let's say that the price cannot change, because a lot of people will say, in a hurricane, it's wrong to raise prices. It's price gouging, it's unfair, and it's wrong. And prices should be regulated to be the same. Okay, what will happen if prices are the same? Let's say I'm very wealthy. I drive up in my big truck. Prices are $5 for flashlights. I have a good number of children, my friends, my family's at my house. I have a big house. I have lots of rooms. I want to have, a lot of light everywhere. $5 for a flashlight is nothing because I'm very wealthy. So I buy, 25 flashlights. Fine, perfect. Or 10, let's say 10 flashlights to make it simple, right? So $50, I buy 10 flashlights. I bring it back and I give a flashlight to all my children, my friends, my mom, my dad, etc. And we have our lights shining it's great. Okay? If the prices were $20, I would not do that because it would cost me, way more. What did I say? About 10 flashlights? Is that what I said? Yeah. So now it would cost me $200 to buy the same. So I'm not going to spend $200. So maybe I buy only 2 or 3 flashlights. I really only need 2 or 3 flashlights. I don't need 10 flashlights. But they're so cheap, and I'm the first one there, I might as well buy them. Now, if I buy all the flashlights up, and then the other people come, and the other people come, and the other people come, all of a sudden the flashlights are gone. So in fact, fewer people, those who are early or those who are wealthier, whatever, get more of the flashlights. So you actually have fewer people with the flashlights instead of more people with the flashlights. Why? Because the price wasn't able to go up. If the price was gone up, I'm not going to spend $200 on flashlights for a hurricane. So I'll buy 2 flashlights for $40. And that's good enough, and we can use them and trade them around. You say, what about poor people? Poor people can't afford it. Well, number one, if prices aren't up, maybe poor people, because they don't have a car, they're not getting there as fast. They don't have a big truck that they can drive through the bad roads. By the time they get there, all the flashlights are gone. Or maybe there's 2 flashlights left, and the poor people can get together and say, listen, let's go in it together. And you spend 10, I spend 10, we buy a flashlight. And then you have, again, broader distribution. Now, let's say it's not political. Let's say it's not price. And let's say the Argentine comes to buy the flashlight. I don't like Argentina. Okay? You don't have any Argentine steaks, so I'm not selling you a flashlight. I could actually discriminate against the person, but I have $20. I want to pay the flashlight. It doesn't matter. I have $5. I want to pay the flashlight. It doesn't matter. I'm not selling flashlights for $5. They're not worth it. They're worth $20. The government told me I can't sell it any higher. I'm not going to sell it to anybody but my friends and my family. We don't have any flashlights. All right? The other thing that takes place is it creates the conditions for a black market or a shadow economy. I come in, I buy the 20 flashlights, and now I sell them on the street for $20 or $25. Right? So anyway, you're starting to see what's happening. And one of the things that we need to pay attention to is that price, surprisingly, ends up being the most just the least susceptible to discrimination, and tends to create the widest distribution of goods and services. So price, apart from being some type of like abuse of the poor, ends up oftentimes being the best method of access. Okay, and so price is a very important thing. All right. And I already talked about the mutual benefit of trade. Now, so the mutual benefit of trade, the market, scarcity, and all of these things, all these things form what we call a market. Now, we tend to think of markets as kind of guys on Wall Street smoking cigars, bankers driving Porsches, right? Guys making clicks on their computers and all of these things like that. But that's not what a market is. Markets are networks of human relationships, right? They're networks of human relationships where people get together to buy and sell goods and services to benefit themselves and others. That's what markets are. And so when we begin to think about like these kind of core elements of economics, it changes the way we think, okay? And then the other thing I think that's important to remember is well, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. Okay, all right, so let's talk very briefly. How much time do I have? 5 minutes?
Dinner is at 12, so we still have 15 minutes.
Okay, all right. All right.
Then we have no Q&A.
No, we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. I'll do it pretty fast. So there, anyway, the point as you're seeing is that there's a lot we could talk about. Let me do a couple of quick things and we'll finish off. I think one of the other deep problems with the way we think about economics is that there are lots of economic fallacies that permeate the kind of common thinking and especially tend to permeate religious thinking. All right? If you're interested in philosophy and theology, as I am, we can oftentimes tend to kind of pick up these economic fallacies. Let me talk about a couple of the fallacies. And my former colleague, Jay Richards, wrote a nice book called Money, Greed, and God. Is that the name of the book? Money, Greed, and God, where he actually talks about these fallacies. It's a really good book. I highly recommend it. Okay, Money, Greed, and God. I have a reading list on my website, which is michaelmathesonmiller.com. And if you go there, you see recommended readings. You click, and there's a lot of recommended readings from everything from philosophy of love to moral philosophy to economics and economic development. So if you're interested, that book by Jay Richards is there. Okay. One of the things Jay he talks about the nirvana fallacy. One of the great fallacies in economics is the nirvana fallacy. And this is contrasting the current market situation or contrasting, say, a market economy or capitalism, whatever you want to call it. By the way, I don't like the word capitalism. I tend not to use the word capitalism because, one, it's a Marxist word. Yeah, Proust is the first person to use it. Yeah.
I knew that this would come.
Yeah. Yeah, it tends to be a Marxist word, and Proust is the first person to use it.
Marx made it very fashionable.
Yeah, and most people understand it this way. And then the second, okay, we'll talk about it in a minute. It's the second reason I don't tend to use it is actually more important, is that when people talk about capitalism, there's lots of varieties of capitalism. There's crony capitalism, there's managerial capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. So yesterday we were talking about, like, the Holy Father, his experience of capitalism in Argentina, right, is crony capitalism. This is what he's experienced. And so when he thinks capitalism, when you say capitalism to an Argentine, right, they think, oh, this is big business, big government exploiting the poor. Right? So because there's so many varieties of capitalism, because there's so much of a negative view of capitalism, I tend not to use the word capitalism. I think it's better to use the word like a free exchange or a market economy. I think it's much more effective. Now, you could debate with Father Ronheimer, who likes to debate, that maybe it's not, and we can talk about that in the Q&A, but the big reason I don't use the word capitalism is because when you use the word capitalism, immediately the mind of your listener takes whatever they think capitalism is, and that's how they hear you talk. So if you're talking about something, if you're talking about an idea or a concept, and you want them to think differently about it, then it's important that we don't use a word that they have already associated with lots of negative feelings. Otherwise, you're now in a double battle. You're trying to make them see something about the economy, make them see something about economic relationships, and not only do you have to overcome that, you now have to overcome the negative hostile sentiment that is combined with the word you use. So that's why I tend to use the word, not to use the word capitalism. But however, back to the nirvana fallacy. One is contrasting capitalism with an unrealizable ideal rather than with its live alternatives, okay? So one of the problems, you hear this all the time, and I think I do this sometimes. You say, well, here's a situation, and these are the deals. These are the relationships, and this is what's going to happen. People say, no, we don't want that. We don't need price. Can't we just have an economy of gift? Okay? Can't we just have this? Or can't we have this? Or can't we have, you know, if everyone would just not be greedy, right? It would all fall into place. And Milton Friedman, I remember in a debate, he says, well, greed is everywhere. There's greed in socialist economies. There's greed in market economies. You know, there's greed everywhere. So one of the fallacies that we have to be aware of is contrasting or comparing the perfect, unrealizable heaven on earth versus capitalism, right? Instead of comparing apples to oranges, we compare apples to the Platonic apple. Okay, and we don't want to do that. We want to compare reasonable alternatives. And Jay points this out and deals with it in his book. The second one is ignoring unintended consequences and trade-offs. This is a huge problem in economics, is to ignore the unintended consequences. I already talked about this a little bit with steel. Let me give you another example of rent control. One of the goals, one of the great ideas is we're going to create rent control. We're going to limit the upper value of prices for rents. Why? Because if rents keep going up and up and up and up and up, then poor people are not going to be able to afford houses. So in a lot of places, they imposed rent control. Makes sense, right? Because now the rent can't go so high so that poor people they don't get locked out. But the unintended consequences of rent control are housing shortages, and usually the poor get locked out, right? People stop moving. So a person moves into a place, he doesn't need that place, but he doesn't want to move to a new place because then the rent's going to go up higher. People who are builders stop building houses that fit into the rent. They only build luxury apartments or businesses. They don't want to lose their money. So what happens is you create all of these policies that have unintended consequences. There's a documentary film called Who Killed the Electric Car? And they're talking about the electric car, and I don't know if the filmmakers realized that they gave part of the answer away. They might have, I don't know. But in this, what happened is companies in California, car companies started building electric cars, and they were experimenting with them. And people really liked them. And they just had a little division in their firms building electric cars. And so they didn't even sell the electric cars, they leased them because they were still in prototype. And people really liked the electric cars, and they were using them, and it was starting to grow. And the state of California made a law because they wanted to increase electric cars. They thought this was a great thing for energy. And they said, okay, if you are a car company that produces electric cars, then X percent, I forget whatever, of your business has to be electric cars. Now in the film, they talk about all the people who are so sad that their electric cars were taken away. The car companies took the electric cars back and they shut down their electric car division. Why? Because it was not feasible for them to do 10% of their income or investment into electric cars. It wasn't feasible. So instead, they said, forget it, it's not worth it. If we don't have electric car division, then we're not required by this law. So they shut down their electric car divisions. That's the unintended consequences of effects. We have to pay attention, like what's going to happen. This goes back to the beginning of Hazlitt's definition. Thinking long run for everywhere. Okay. The next fallacy is our false extrapolations. Okay. One of the great false extrapolations is assuming unlimited population growth. Okay. People will say an extrapolation, right? If we're growing at this rate, we have this many people now. In 10 years, we'll have, well, now we have 1 million people. In 10 years, we'll have 2 million people. In 20 years, we'll have 40 million people. If this trend continues, there will be people, like so many people that the world will fall, they'll start falling off the world, right? Or one of the things you hear is global warming. Global warming is an extrapolation, right? This morning when we woke up, it was, 14 degrees Celsius. By 10 o'clock in the morning, it was 18 degrees Celsius. By noon, it's 21 degrees Celsius. If this trend continues, within 2 days, we will all be burned. Okay, that's a false extrapolation. Okay, now it's obvious when I give you the global warming, I give you the temperature. It's an obvious extrapolation that, oh, well, obviously, you know, in the morning it's cooler and it warms up and it goes back down again, right? That's obvious to you. But I think we need to pay attention to false extrapolations in economics, which happen all the time, right? If this trend continues, all right? Another fallacy is that we assume that the rich and poor are static categories rather than categories through which people pass during their lives. So here's a great example. If you're 24 years old and you just live out right in a poor apartment in Palo Alto, California, okay, and you're only making about $7,000 a year as a waiter, you are very poor. What is not known is that you're in your final year of law school at Stanford and you're going to go to be an investment banker and a lawyer in New York who's going to make $250,000 starting salary in 6 months. Okay? So the thing is, that's the dramatic example, but what you see, if you look at statistics, people don't usually stay in one category their whole life. They move up and down, right? And so it's important to realize that the rich and poor are not static categories. The greatest, I think, economic fallacy, which was already discussed, is the zero-sum game fallacy. The idea that the economy is a pie and that economic growth is not possible. And the most dangerous place we see this is in population control. Most population control arguments are based on the zero-sum game, that if there are more people around, there will be less money to go around. Let me give you an example, and then I'll just 2 things and then we'll finish. Let's say, so the zero-sum game fallacy with population control is partially true. Here's why. Let's say we take a snapshot. Remember, snapshots are always dangerous in economics because economies can grow. Now, everybody please take your money out of your pockets, pool your money, and we'll put it all right here. Okay? Let's go. No, I'm teasing. You don't have to do it. Okay, ready? So you put it all here. Now, we take everybody's money, we pool it together. Now we divide the room in half, and we kill this side of the room. We're all dead. Now, this side of the room gets back up, and they divide the money out. Are they richer than they were before? Yes, of course they are. But what's happened is the productive capacity, the long-term productive capacity of this side of the room is destroyed. So the problem is it's a fallacy that seems correct at a snapshot. You're absolutely right. If there are fewer people, at that moment, and you redistribute it, there'd be more money to go around. But all the productive capacity is gone. So in the long run, you don't have any more money. You've actually lost capacity because people tend, when they're given freedom and opportunity, to produce more than they consume. All right. No, I know that. I'm looking at something here. Yeah. So, all right. So, I've already put these. Oh, there we go. All right. Sorry. Okay. So, one of the things I think as Christians we need to think about as we think about economics, of course, as Christians we have to care about larger questions of society and culture, but good intentions are not sufficient. Right? It's not enough just to feel feelings on behalf of poor people. Okay? It's not enough to feel feelings about the economy. Okay? We are not simply asked to be, to have these strong emotions. All right? What you feel or desire does not always predict what the outcome of a policy should be. And that I think that the core virtue of thinking economically is to cultivate the virtue of prudence, which is to see the world as it is and act accordingly. And this means in the realm of economics that we need to take the discipline of economics quite seriously. We need to study economics and think about economics and think about these kind of core insights before we just talk about them. Because sometimes what can happen is, or make decisions, what can happen is politicians or religious leaders or academics can come up with these wonderful policy programs that end up actually creating injustice. So let's go back to that line from Aquinas where he says that injustice can take place in 2 ways: by the violent act of the man who possesses power and by the false prudence of the sage. So it's very important, especially in the realm of economics, that we don't exercise false prudence that actually results in injustice, but that we take seriously the reality of economics. I used to say when I would teach undergraduate students, you don't break the commandments as much as you break yourself against them, right? Because they're about reality. And the same thing with economics. So I would say as we think about economics, we must think about it in the terms of the cardinal virtues, and most specifically, the cardinal virtue of prudence. Okay, thank you.